Good evening to all of you who've joined us today for this meeting. As you know, this is one of the topics which is part of the Your Health series that is being provided and presented by Discover Truth Ireland, and also supported by the Adventist Discovery Centre as well. I think before we hadn't, let me check my slides. Sorry, I'm just having issues with my slides. Yes. Okay. So I think before we start, just a disclaimer to share that all the information I'm sharing here is just general educational information, and it's not designed for an individual to follow the methods as part of treatment or cure of particular disease. And if you have any medical conditions, I always advise you to contact your GP or any physician or other health professional for specific decisions about your personal health. Okay, and as I shared, this is part of a series of lessons from the Adventist Discovery Centre called Your Health. You can find that on the website I've listed below. And if you'd like to read through some of the booklets and have a little bit of feedback from the team from ADC, you're welcome to join in. The courses are all free, and it can be done online, or they can send a paper copy to you. Also, this material is available on the discovertruth.ie website, and there's also a link to the video and other videos from previous series on that link, and I'd encourage you to visit that website. There's lots of other information about life in general, spiritual life, family life, resources for children, and other reading material. That's all free. You're welcome to look at that. So what are the objectives I have today? I'd like us to just learn a little bit about what cancer is, what causes it, how to detect cancer early so as to reduce our risk of having cancer and complications of cancer, and also lifestyle interventions that we can apply in our life to reduce our cancer risk. So what is cancer? So to understand what cancer is, it's good to understand how the cells repair themselves. So when a cell undergoes some kind of damage, there are various things that can damage cells, and I'll share those a bit later. The DNA itself, so the center of the cell, where the cell where the instructions for the cell's behavior are, can sometimes be damaged. In a normal system, there is a repair mechanism. So either that DNA is repaired, or if the DNA is damaged a lot, the cell is then signaled for dying, and the cell dies, and that's not a problem. We have lots of other cells that can replace it. But what happens when there's cancer is that you have this DNA damage that happens to the cell from toxins or other environmental causes. But for some reason that we don't know sometimes, and some reasons we do know, the damage affects the way the cell multiplies. So the cell remains alive, but it multiplies in a way that's not healthy. So there is, it multiplies so much that it doesn't behave normally. It invades the local structures sometimes, and in the worst case scenario, it can spread through the blood vessels and through the lymphatic system to other parts of the body and implant there. And that's when we call this cancer. Okay. And so what are the things that can cause cell damage? So these can include our lifestyles, our diet, and we'll talk about that a bit later. It can include chemicals. Certain infections can predispose the cells to have damage happening to them. Ultraviolet radiation, so things like the sunlight is part of the ultraviolet radiation spectrum, X-rays, and also radioactive materials. And people in certain areas of the country can be exposed to things like radon as well. And there is genetic predisposition, where some cells already have genetic errors in them, and the addition of other environmental factors can then make it easier for that cell to get damaged. So just so we know how much how serious of an illness cancer is, I was actually quite surprised when I was looking through this data, that cancer is actually the primary cause of death in Ireland. This was statistics from 2018, and it has overtaken heart disease and cardiovascular disease. So when you say circulatory diseases, it includes stroke and heart attacks as the primary cause of death. It's not very far away, but it is interesting for both women and men that cancer is the primary cause of death in Ireland. It's also the same in Northern Ireland, where again, cancer is the primary cause of death. Globally, so across the world, cancer is the second leading cause of death. So the first one is usually the cardiovascular diseases. And we know that about 40% of cancers are preventable, potentially preventable, and a third can be cured early with early detection and treatment. And the leading risk factors which cause cancer, when they did various studies for both male and female, were smoking, alcohol use, and raised BMI, which is your body mass index. In countries, this low SDI just means social development index. In those areas, so those are your low-income countries. The three leading risk factors for cancer were smoking, unsafe sex, and alcohol. But in higher income countries, the three leading factors are just similar to the global risk, so smoking, alcohol, and a raised BMI. So this is just a graph to just demonstrate that. And just to look at the different sexes. So in men, smoking is the highest risk factor for cancer, alcohol, diet, and then air pollution. For women, it is also smoking that is the highest risk for cancer. That's something that we often forget. Unsafe sex, dietary risks, high BMI, and also high blood sugar levels. And there's also various other risks as well, lower down on the chart that you see there. So what are the ways we can use to reduce our risk of cancer or having the late detection of cancer? So I think it's important, although we're talking about risks, but to also talk about the early detection, which includes screening methods. There are some medical interventions that can be used for cancer. This is usually in people who have a higher risk of cancer because of genetic reasons. We also should avoid carcinogens, which are agents that we know cause cancer, and I'll share some of those. Lifestyle modification and dietary practices, which we'll go into more detail. So in Ireland and also in the UK, they have national cancer screening programs. The only three programs that are officially running, and applies to most countries as well, are breast checks, which involves a mammogram for women age 50 years and above. This is done every 2 years in Ireland, and the next slide would just say it's every 3 years in the UK. Women also go through a cervical check, which is a smear check, which is done for all women above the age of 25. This has changed recently because we're now able to test for the HPV virus, and depending on whether or not you have HPV will depend on the number of years of screening between each, the amount of time between each screen. So if you have the right high risk HPV, you might have to come for screening a bit more frequently. If you don't, then you can come a bit later, sometimes 3 years, sometimes 5 years, depending whether in Ireland or in the UK. Bowel screening is for looking for blood, which can be a sign of colorectal cancer. So this is offered for all men and women age 60 and above. In Ireland, it's up to 69, and in the UK, it's up to 74. So this is something that's done every 2 years. And it's very important for us when we get these reminders, I'll just share the UK details there, that we respond to them, because you find a lot of people do not respond to their screens. And then you find they have cancer later on down the line. So it's really important to respond to these screenings when you get the alerts from your GP, or if you even from today, if you're reminded about it. Most of these websites, if you go to the NHS or to the HSE website, you can actually book in for some of these tests without even having to go through your GP if you're behind in your screening. Recently in the UK, and I think in the States as well, they've been trialing some tests where people who used to smoke or people who currently smoke will go in for a lung health check. This involves different questions about your general lung health, the lifestyle factors, but for a lot of the people, it will also include a low-dose CT scan of the lung. And depending on what they find, you might not have to get any further tests, or you'd get several tests, follow-up tests, a few years down the line. So this is not available in all parts of the UK, but we hope that it will spread later on down the line. It's also important to know what your family risk is. So if in your family you notice that a number of people in your family, especially first-degree relatives, have had cancer, it's really important to try and do a map and know what kind of cancers happened, because there are certain genes that run in families and are inherited. And if you know those genes, you can then, if you know there's that risk, you can get genetic testing, which is offered by the various health services. And depending on the results of that would depend on this kind of screening that you might need. So just for a few examples that I put here, there are lots of other examples. We've heard a lot about this BRCA gene that's associated with breast and ovarian cancer. It increases your risk quite significantly. And some people, and we know some celebrities have made the news for getting things like getting their breasts excised, so mastectomies, to prevent the risk. And that actually does reduce your risk quite significantly for breast cancer, but it is quite a drastic way of reducing your risk. Also, some colorectal cancers are linked to genetic conditions. So some have where there's a higher risk of getting polyps, and that's familial adenomatous polyposis. In these cases, once if you found to have that high risk gene, you might be called in, depending on the condition, for more frequent colonoscopy. So that's the camera test of the bowel. There are some drug treatments like aspirin, and in some cases is thought might be able to prevent the development of cancer from some adenomas and some polyps. In some cases, some people do get surgery to remove part of the bowel to reduce their risk of getting cancer. And there are also many other new treatments being looked into. An important thing as well with cancer is we're obviously going to talk about reducing your risk of cancer, but it's also important to detect cancer early in ourselves. So this is just a little acronym that gives us some guidance on the things that we need to think about and seek advice when we notice these things in our own health. So if you have a change in your bowel habits or bladder habits, or notice blood, sores that don't heal, discharges, unusual bleeding, lumps in our breasts. So that's important for us to examine our breasts if you're women, and for men, for example, examining your testicles, so that you know what the normal is like, and if you feel something unusual, you can get help. If you're having any problems with swallowing or indigestion that is not responding to the regular treatments, it's worth seeking advice for that. And again, any changes in a wart or a mole, and coughs that don't seem to improve, and without any cause that you see and you notice. So it's worth getting immediate help when you notice these signs. So just some things about cancer risk itself. So the good news is that most people who are treated with cancer don't die from the disease. Sorry, a spelling mistake there. And unfortunately, about less than a third of the population will develop cancer in their lifetime. And cancers tend to occur in older people in general, so people 60, 70, 80. But there are cancers in younger people, but these seem to be often linked with hereditary factors. But there is, unfortunately, that cancer is occurring in younger people, but the general trend is that it's still a disease that affects older people. So when we're thinking of cancer prevention, we have to be very careful, because cancer is quite a emotional subject to talk about. Most of us will know somebody who has either had cancer or has maybe died from cancer, or has cancer even now. And we're talking about a friend of ours who unfortunately passed away from cancer. And we do our best to, when we're thinking about prevention, we're not thinking of individual cases, often in statistics, but we're thinking of a community, the bigger picture, and trying to reduce the number of cases in that community. So it means that we try to avoid, prevention tries to avoid some of the cases that would otherwise occur, but we can't always stop every cancer from happening. And as I said before, about 40% of cancers are potentially preventable, but we need to remember that we don't start from the same baseline. So there are hereditary conditions that predispose us to cancer, as I mentioned. The inequities and inequalities in medical care. Not everybody is able to get the same medical care. Some of us are exposed to hazardous working and living conditions that put us in environments that put us at higher risk of cancer. And there are some things that we cannot modify. So our age, we can't change that. And also things that happen to us very early in our lives as children, or even in the womb, can predispose us to cancer. We're not really able to change that as adults. So the recommendations I'm going to share, and those we've been sharing throughout these series, are not a guarantee that your cancer will be reduced. And it's also not a prison. So if you've had some of these illnesses, it's not something that you should beat yourself up and kind of say, oh, maybe it's because I did this, maybe because I did that. We want you to move forward. And these recommendations will lower your risk of cancer. And as many recommendations as you can follow will reduce your risk even further. So what are some of these lifestyle factors? And there's a study that suggested that you can have a 33% reduction in your lifetime risk of cancer if you practice some of the all four of the following. So that's never smoking, having a body mass index less than 30. So for those who went to some of the previous talks, I think the talk last week explained a little bit about how body mass index is calculated. So this is a measure of your weight, and BMI, ideal BMI should be between 18 and 25. So above 25 and also above 30, of course, is in the overweight and also the least category. We need to increase our physical activity, and I'll share more about these things, and also have a diet that's high in fruit, vegetables, whole grains, and low in meat. So these are some recommendations. This is from the World Cancer Research Foundation. Again, it reiterates some of the things that will help to reduce your risk of cancer. And I'll go through some of these as well now. So healthy weight, high BMI, so increased weight that's not in the healthy range, is associated with the number of cancers. So the main ones are oropharyngeal cancer, so that's cancers of the mouth and also the pharynx, kind of the throat. Esophageal cancer, the gullet, stomach, pancreas, gallbladder, liver, colorectal cancer, breast cancer, ovarian cancer, and prostate cancer. So what is it about our BMI that increases the risk of these cancers? So often when people have got raised BMI, you've got increased fat around the organs, and fat, and also fat around the organs itself is a pro-inflammatory substance. So when you have raised inflammation, that causes irritation of the cells. It increases cell replication, cell damage, and that can then put you at a risk of having cancer. Also, we know that insulin, particularly, is a growth hormone. So people who are overweight and have high BMI often have what's called insulin resistance. So the cells are not reacting very well to insulin and allowing the glucose to enter the cell. So this insulin this excess insulin that's floating around your body has a growth factor, has a growth element. So it increases cell replication and also sometimes stops that cell death that we talked about at the beginning. So instead of a cell being killed off when it's abnormal, the cell hangs around a little bit longer and then has a chance to replicate and then cause cancer. In particular for esophageal cancer, increased body weight is also is associated with increased reflux. So reflux is where the stomach acid comes up into the esophagus, and that can be caused by various things: a diet high in fat, being overweight as well, and also certain foods like very spicy foods can do that. And that relaxes there's a sphincter or a gate, a gate or a little elastic tube you can imagine at the bottom of the esophagus, and that's loosened up if you've got very high BMI because of the pressure from your abdomen, and also some of the hormones, the substances in high fat meals also loosen that up. And as I said, that acid irritates the lower part of the esophagus, causing a condition in some people called Barrett's esophagus, and that is where the cells are not replicating properly, and they form what's called a metaplasia. So they're not the normal type of cells, and that then those cells can then transform into a cancer. And before, we always thought of esophageal cancer as being associated with smoking, and it is, especially cancers of the upper esophagus. But now cancers of the lower esophagus are increasing because of increased weight as well. So that's something to consider. Breast cancer is interesting when it comes to weight. Some of the studies show that actually being slightly overweight actually reduces your chance of breast cancer before menopause. But after menopause, if your weight is increasing, especially as women, unfortunately, sometimes are at higher risk of gaining weight after menopause. And this is what can actually put you at a risk of breast cancer, because you have more estrogen, because estrogen tends to be in the fat cells as well. So you have more estrogen floating around than should normally be at the menopause time. And that can then trigger you to have put you at risk of breast cancer. And the similar mechanism is also there for ovarian and endometrial cancer. So how can we achieve a healthy weight? I won't go into this in so much detail. You can listen to last week's talk. But the key things would be increasing your physical activity, having foods high in dietary fiber, a Mediterranean type dietary pattern. Also, having been breastfed puts you at a low risk of being overweight, reducing your screen time, and also avoiding Western type diet. So these are diets that are quite high in fat, high in processed foods, which also put us at a risk of having raised weight. But there is, as I said, you can listen to a more comprehensive discussion of this from the talk we had last week. So being physically active, just to go into this in a little more detail. Again, we've had a talk on this, so I won't labor it too much. This has been, some studies have shown that this reduces your risk of colon cancer, breast cancer, and endometrial cancer. In colon cancer, they feel that it could be the fact that, again, your digestion is stimulated. So I know for sure if I've gone for a good walk, if I've had problems with the gassiness or whatever, they're solved by having a good walk, also, it helps your insulin sensitivity and weight loss, which all contribute to reducing your cancer risk. Again, there's some studies that show that having vigorous activity pre-menopause and post-menopause can reduce your chances of breast cancer. And the recommendations are to exercise at least 30 minutes a day, and this should be moderate intensity. So what are some of the dietary aspects that are recommended with cancer? There's this is quite a vast topic, and there are lots of studies, and some things are conclusive and some are things where people need to look into it a bit more, but there are some general principles that we can share. So whole grains are known to reduce the risk of colorectal cancer. So the reason for this in particular is with whole grains, the fiber in the whole. Sorry, I'll skip that. I've got a slide on that later on. But the whole grains have increased fiber, and that improves your risk of colorectal cancer. Foods which are contaminated with aflatoxins can increase your risk of liver cancer. So that's something to avoid. And aflatoxins they come from mold that is often seen in foods that are preserved in kind of damp conditions. Unfortunately, these are often in countries where low economic social status. So sometimes food is not taken care of as well. Especially things like nuts, you need to be careful. They've peanuts in particular, some kinds of beans, legumes, but even grains can be a risk of aflatoxin contamination. So that's something just to be aware of when you're in the UK. It's not such a big risk, but if you're traveling abroad, then that's something to think about. Also, we should avoid foods that are preserved by salting, and these are clearly known to increase the risk of stomach cancer. This is, in Asia, this is quite a big risk. And also, I remember when I was studying in some parts of Eastern Europe, where this is quite common that food is salted or preserved by salting, that can definitely increase your risk of stomach cancer. The way we need to eat is by having a healthy plate and eating the rainbow. Again, we've had a few talks about this, but just as a quick reminder. So when you look at your plate, half of it should be fruits and vegetables. The other half, one section can be whole grains or whole starches, I'd say, and then a healthy protein for the other quarter. And then trying to and using water as a drink rather than juices or fizzy drinks, processed drinks, and limiting your intake of oil. So fruits and non-starchy vegetables have quite a lot of anti-tumor agents. There's a whole list: carotenoids, flavonoids, selenium, various vitamins. Also, they have lots of dietary fiber. And these anti-tumor agents act in different ways. Some generally act to reduce inflammation around the cells. Others have roles in cell repair, and also others kind of sweep up what's called reactive oxygen species, which happen when the cells are metabolizing. So when oxygen is being made, these species are swept away, and because they can cause disruption and damage to the cells. So it's important to really fill our plates with these good foods. So just a brief stop on high fiber diets and colorectal cancer. So this is one of the things that has got very strong evidence supporting it. So we need to really increase our fiber. The recommendation is about 30 to 40 grams of fiber a day. I think I mentioned before in my previous talk about the surgeon Dennis Burkitt, who studied in Africa. And that's where he realized that there was quite a low risk of colorectal cancer. It was almost unknown. This was, I think in the 50s, 60s. And he made the connection that it was the fiber in the diets in Africa that really reduced your risk of cancer. So what does fiber do that's beneficial to our colon? So it's fiber, as we know, reduces the intestinal transit time. So this is the time that it takes from the time you eat something to the time that it's passed out. Okay, and this ideally should be about 1 to 2 days. But we know that in a lot of populations, it's a much longer time. And so if the food is passing through your bowel much quicker, it means that there's a reduction in the time that toxins that bind to the fiber, which is what they do, these toxins won't hang around in your bowel so long to cause damage to the lining of the bowel. Also, the fiber interacts with the gut bacteria to produce substances like butyrate, which are felt to have anti-inflammatory activity. So that again, they reduce inflammation and calm down any reactions to cell damage in the gut bacteria. Also, like we said before, high fiber diets are associated with reduced insulin resistance. So that means that your cells are not going to be promoted to replicate or to grow. There's also an interesting association which I came across, where, of course, if you've got a high fiber diet, then your stool is nice and soft. You're not straining. And straining is what can sometimes cause things like piles. But there's a connection that some scientists have made that when we strain, we increase the pressure in our abdomen, and that can sometimes push our stomach up, so causing a hernia. So hernia, and that loosening that I mentioned earlier of the esophagus. And then with that comes reflux and of the acid into the esophagus, and then putting you at a slightly higher risk of not only colorectal cancer, but also esophageal cancer. So we need to increase the fiber. And again, that comes from those fruits, vegetables, and whole grains as well. There are some things that we need to avoid, and I'll just share them briefly. So the evidence is very strong that red meat increases your risk of colorectal cancer, as does processed meats. In fact, these, by the World Health Organizations, are considered as what are called class 1 carcinogens. Also, we know that salted meats increase your risk of nasopharyngeal cancer. Dairy products and calcium have been seen to actually reduce your risk of colorectal cancer. So that's something to consider. So we need to limit our consumption of red meat and processed meats to about 18 ounces or 150 grams a week, which is quite a small amount. I think in the lesson that we have for this mentions that meat should be considered as a condiment if you are going to eat it. So not as the main dish. Also, when we're cooking meat, if you do eat meat, is to avoid the meat being exposed to very high temperatures. So, frying, grilling, barbecues, that causes changes in the proteins of the meat, and which are toxic and can predispose you to cancer. Also, toxic chemicals from the flames stick to the meat. So that should be meat, and then that again can put you at a risk of cancer. The studies show that grilled fruit and vegetables don't generate these compounds, but again, if you are going to grill fruit and veg, don't let it burn. So any burnt things, even toast and things like that, are not ideal. And some studies are showing that marinating your meat before grilling can reduce the formation of some of these cancerous toxins. So sometimes we think of supplements as things that could help in cancer reduction, and there's lots of articles online about taking this pill and that herb and the next one on its own. Generally, so the big kind of medical recommendations of the big research centers have not seen any specific supplements that can reduce cancer in themselves. Not to say that there's not much research that needs to be done, but the advice in general is that it's better for us to eat a healthy diet rather than rely on dietary supplements to protect against cancer. And just one example is about carotenoids. So we mentioned that carotenoids are very you find high contents of these in fruit and vegetables, and these are very protective against cancer. But studies where they took beta carotene, which is a molecule, and made that into a medication, they were hoping that would actually reduce your cancer, but unfortunately found that it increased the cancer in lung cancer in smokers or ex-smokers. So that is just an example of where if you take one item out, it's not necessarily going to help you. It's actually the whole thing, the whole fruit, or the whole vegetable that helps to reduce your cancer risk. Calcium is a bit different. Again, I think it's the calcium in dairy that can decrease your colorectal cancer risk. Alcohol is not recommended at all. It increases lots of cancers, specifically cancers of the mouth, of the throat, the esophagus, and the liver, but also more recently, we know cancers of the breast and colon are increased with alcohol use. So the recommendation, if you are going to drink, specifically for cancer risk, is to reduce this to two drinks a day for men and 1 drink for women. And we know that's not to drink every day. So you should always have gaps in your drinking if you are going to do that. But ideally, just if you can stop drinking, that would be the best thing for your cancer risk. I did mention earlier about breastfeeding. So studies have shown that mothers who breastfeed have a lower risk for breast cancer later on when they're older. And children who are breastfed as well may have lower cancer risk because of the fact that there's a slightly lower chance that they become overweight and obese in adulthood. We know that not every woman can breastfeed, but it's advised that if you can, try to do that. And the World Health Organization recommends breastfeeding to the first at least up to the first 6 months of life, so exclusive breastfeeding, and then you can start introducing other foods after that. Just one thing I wanted to briefly share about as well is sexual health and cancer risk. So there are a number of cancers which are clearly linked to our sexual health. Cervical cancer is one of those, and the human papillomavirus is the major cause for cervical cancer, which is a recent, relatively recent finding, so much that has changed our screening our methods now. And HPV is quite common and is seen in most people who are sexually active. There are different types of HPV, so some are quite benign and the body is able to clear them, and you don't have ongoing cancer risk. But there are types which are associated with high cancer risk. So the way to reduce your risk of cervical cancer is obviously to practice safe sex, to reduce your number of partners, and barrier methods can also reduce your risk. Recently, a vaccination has now been introduced that is offered to girls and boys in some countries, but I know in Ireland and in the UK it's offered to girls aged between 12 and 13, because that's about the age when girls become sexually active in these countries. It's also important to attend for your screening, as I said before, because that increases your detection, and then treatments can be put in place early. HIV is also another disease that is associated with increased risk of cancer. There are two different kinds of risks. So there's cancers that are specifically what are called AIDS-defining cancers. So people who have these have got a very high risk of having AIDS. And if you're HIV positive and you develop one of these cancers, they consider you to now have AIDS, the disease. So this is Kaposi sarcoma, which is kind of 500 times increased risk. So if you see that, it's very common that it's in somebody who's got HIV. Certain types of non-Hodgkin lymphomas and cervical cancer. So if you've got HIV, your chance of cervical cancer increased about 3 times. The other cancers which are slightly increased in HIV, so cancers of the anus, liver, oropharynx, the lung, and Hodgkin's lymphoma. Most of these cancers here are associated with viruses that cause those cancers. So, for example, Kaposi sarcoma is associated with the human HHV8. EBV is associated with some of the cancers of the oropharynx, that's the nose and the mouth. So it seems that when you have HIV, your immune system is much weaker and is not able to fight these viral infections. And then that inflammation and that infection can then lead to cancer, where in a healthier person, that would not have been the case. So how do you reduce your risk for this? So if you're in a high risk population for HIV, and you can check for that, it's worth getting tested for HIV. If you do have HIV, then it's important to be in contact with your sexual health clinic or your infectious diseases clinic and make sure you've got the right medications that are known to lower your risk of Kaposi's cancer and also the non-Hodgkin's lymphoma. It's important to quit smoking because that smoking increases your risk of lung cancer anyway, but if you've got HIV, that risk is increased further. Know your hepatitis status. Often that's tested together anyway, but in certain countries that might have been missed. So make sure you know what your hepatitis status is. Again, that's a blood test. And also for women who have HIV, they're invited to actually go for cervical screening annually, so every single year, where other women will be every 3 years or so. So it's important. It might be, annoying to have to do that, but it's very important to attend for those screenings. So other factors that I'm not going to discuss in detail right now, because we've discussed them before, about things that increase our risk for cancer, things that we can do to reduce our risk for cancer. So smoking cessation. So as we saw in the slides earlier, smoking is the biggest risk factor for cancer. It was about 30 or so % of cancers are associated with smoking. So that's something to stop and get help to stop. And it's better to stop it altogether rather than reduce, because even when you reduce, unfortunately, the risk remains. Avoid getting sunburned. So melanoma is a cancer of the skin. And if you're out in the sun for more than 20 minutes, it's useful to have protective clothing and to wear sunscreen, even when it's cloudy, and avoid things like tanning salons. And as I mentioned, some of us work in jobs where we might be exposed to certain agents that can predispose us to cancer. So we know asbestos is associated with a specific type of lung cancer. And I know in the UK anyway, that's a notifiable illness, in the sense that if somebody has asbestos, then they have to, if they die or they get unwell, they're treated. They've got extra tests and follow up based on that. Also, other substances like arsenic, radiation. So people who are, for example, radiologists, radiographers. I remember I used to work in theatre sometimes, and we have to wear protective gowns, and sometimes you get people like, oh no, it's okay, I'll just quickly go in and out, and it won't take time. But make sure, if you're in those occupations, take all the protection that is provided, so they can reduce your risk for those cancers. So in conclusion, as we said before, 40% of cancers are potentially preventable. We need to remember to be compassionate, because we don't all start from the same risk, but we try our best. So try to do all those steps that you can. And often when change comes, you don't change everything at once. You take one step at a time when you're trying to reduce your risk for cancer or any other medical condition. It's important as a community as well to support each other as we are changing our habits. And I think this is what we've been doing here on this platform as well. And a lot of cancer risk, it's only 40% that's attributable to lifestyle. So the others are things that maybe have to change at a larger scale. So having healthy environments for ourselves and other people. Maybe if you're involved in government or influential things, where you can help to make decisions to make our communities healthier spaces. Also, as a community and also as individuals, we can ask God to help us as we try to make the lifestyle changes and to follow these recommendations to help us have healthier lives. Because these recommendations not only help for cancer as well, they help for other conditions, as we've seen: diabetes, high blood pressure, heart disease. And it's important that we try and incorporate them in our lives. And if somebody does get cancer, don't be disheartened, because even following these recommendations can reduce your risks of complications from that cancer, and also from getting secondary cancers. Because we know that now, with good treatment being available for cancer, some people will have one cancer, but later on in life, they'll get another cancer. So these lifestyle changes are important, even if you have had cancer in the past. So just some 3 texts from the Bible, just to encourage us as well, because God wants us to be in good health, and and we know that we have illness around us, but we know that through God we can have good health despite that. So there's a prayer from John there. It says, "I pray, dear friend, I pray that you may enjoy good health and that all may go well with you, even as your soul is getting well." And then there's a verse there from John. They're all from John, they're all from John the disciple. The thief comes only to steal, kill, and destroy. So cancer is a bit like a thief that wants to kind of destroy our lives, but Jesus has come, as it was in this text, that we may have life and have it to the full. So although there is illness, there are some provisions, even in this broken world, that can help us live healthier lives. And then there's just that exciting promise that even in heaven, there's going to be cancer treatment and cancer prevention going on there. There's a verse that's just describing what's called the new earth. And it says, the angel showed me the river of the water of life, clear as crystal, flowing down from the throne of God and of the Lamb down the middle of the great street of the city. At each side of the city stood the tree of life, bearing 12 crops of fruit. So you can't escape fruit when you go to heaven, and in the new earth as well. So there's different fruit every month. And then the leaves of the tree are for the healing of the nations. So that's also encouraging. And then no longer will there be any curse. So we look forward to that time when we won't have to worry about diseases like cancer, because there'll be healing for us, not only from the tree, but because God himself will be there as well. So thank you for listening. And I hope you've been able to learn a few pearls that you can take home with you and practice in the next week. Thanks.